Okay, so let's move to Vietnam, which is the most significant, at least from the U.S. side, the most significant. I don't know why I have headphones on. The most significant hot war of the period. Um, and so essentially, there's a struggle between the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese are aligned, um, with the Soviets. The South Vietnamese originally aligned with the French, and then with the U.S. And I guess it's essentially it's again the U.S. enters the war to try to contain communism, and they get embroiled there over this period. Eventually pulling out. Eventually they lose the war essentially, and in basically in short order, the North Vietnamese defeat the French, the U.S., and then they actually defeat China. Um, and so um, So essentially, this is a war the U.S. lost. But what's interesting is the reason I want to cover it. Well, one, it's a big war in the Cold War period, but you could do a whole class on the Vietnam War, um, or there's that great documentary series as well. Um, but you kind of see this interesting tension that is played out later on with the U.S. Misadventures after 9/11 between hard and soft power. So you have these quotes, which are emblematic of the hard power approach: get people by the balls and their hearts and minds will follow. The solution in Vietnam is more bombs, more shells, more napalm. So that's the hard power. Essentially, just use as much military force as you can, and eventually you will defeat your enemy. The bottom up approach, or the hearts and mind approach, is really looking at the local conditions, and really um, try to curtail those underlying causes of um, of the initial rebellion, or the issues in the country. In this great quote from the handbook of Marine Handbook in 1940, in small wars, the goal is to gain decisive results with the least application of force. The end aim is the social, economic, and political development of the people. Essentially, the idea is like, what is going wrong here is there's a lack of development. This is causing the rebellion or the uprising or the insurgency. And so if you kind of remedy these ills or work on these ills, you will get peace, or in this case, victory. And so there's this great paper by Dell and Karubin that really examines the bombing campaigns to try to get at which is more effective. All right. And so what they find is that the bombing campaign actually was counterproductive, that it weakened the local governments, lowered the civic engagement, probably turned the local populace against the Americans. Now, there's this contrast where essentially the Marines here are trying to use the hearts and minds approach, and they have a much more positive effect. Essentially, in Vietnam, there are areas where the Marines are operating, and there are areas where the Army is operating. The Army is using a heavy firepower approach. The Marines are using a more holistic approach. Combining, fighting the Viet Cong with, more policies to try to fix the social and economic conditions. And the end result is these ones are more positive. So it's just an interesting paper. This is a massive failure, massive foreign policy failure for the U.S. It's the biggest one of the Cold War. Essentially, they enter this war, they lose the war after losing a significant number of Americans. They don't win. The North Vietnamese takes over Vietnam, and so it's just a massive waste of money and manpower um, on the part of the Americans. Okay, and so after Vietnam, we move into the 80s, and kind of the Soviet Union and their allies starts to unravel. So this is a quote. This is a famous Soviet quote from Soviet worker, or Soviet joke, I guess, old Soviet joke. We pretend to work and they pretend to pay us. And so essentially the economic system of the Soviet Union is just unsustainable. And so by the time we get to the 1980s, the economic power and the cultural power of the US is just too dominant. So you have the U.S. kind of dominating the Soviets in culture, and that, if you read spy accounts at the time, it's really interesting. Like, a lot of the Soviet informers or double agents are actually paid in cultural products, records, Levi's, those sorts of things, because that's what they want. Um, and the U.S. economy is, after '82 recession, is humming along, while the Soviets, they really can't keep up. And the area they really can't keep up in, initially, they have kind of this initial advantage in science and engineering. I mean, famously, they're the first to put a man in space, Yuri Gagarin, in the '50s, and this kind of prompts the U.S. to really focus on STEM, science and engineering. So by the time we get to the 1980s, really the Soviets, they can't keep up with what's happening in Silicon Valley. And so, Silicon Valley really starts getting going in the late 1960s. The history of Silicon Valley is fascinating, but essentially what happens is you get a bunch of firms kind of sprouting up. In the 60s, there's this exodus from Shockley Semiconductor, where these 8 scientists kind of start their own company called Fairchild, and then that breaks up, and so you get it creates this culture of innovation in the valley, where people are leaving companies constantly to start new ones, and the only way you can compete, if that's happening, basically your proprietary knowledge is always getting out there, because you constantly have people leaving and starting new companies, and there's the non-compete clauses are not enforced in California, and so they can compete with you. And so the only way you can compete is then by being super innovative. So you have to compete on innovation. You can't compete by holding on to your patents, holding on to your knowledge. And so this gets the ball rolling in Silicon Valley, where there's all this competition, all this innovation, and you get Moore's law, so you get more and more transistors on a microchip. And so the Soviets, they really just can't keep up with the pace of American technological growth that's really coming out of Silicon Valley. I mean, you read stories, the KGB is like, is buying like Intel microprocessors, trying to reverse engineer it, trying to figure out what's going on. By the time they figure it out, the U.S. is on to the next invention. And so, I'm kind of focused on economics. There are other things going on kind of politically within the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is kind of a collection of many places that were their own country prior. And so you have those ethnic tensions. But it dissolves in, 1991. All right. Okay. So that's the end of the Soviet Union. And again, there are some rosy pictures painted on some corners of the internet of the economic life in the Soviet Union. There is some growth initially, but it's growth that is comparable to basically any other country in this time period. And certainly by the 80s, the economy had stagnated. And so these are just some economic stats to kind of drive that home. We have, less refrigerators. There's a 5 to 6 year wait time to get a car, and the car was of lower quality than one you'd have in America. So there's much less cars in the Soviet Union. So again, this is just like a measure of their economy. It's not saying like, hey, the road to happiness is cars. It's just showing that in terms of productivity, they're having much less amenities. Life expectancy, which is important, actually falls. Over half the population lived in poverty by U.S. standards. Quarter of the population couldn't afford a winter coat. And really, even though they're spending more on research, they can't keep up. They basically can't replicate that hotbed of competition and innovation that is Silicon Valley, but other parts of the U.S. economy as well. I don't want to be too Valley focused. And actually, the best way they had to incentivize, this is work by Lisa Cook, by the way, who made an appearance earlier in the course. The best way they had to incentivize the Soviets, their scientists, by letting them patent in foreign countries. And as I mentioned, they had to keep stealing Western technology to try to keep up. And so essentially this is unsustainable. They just can't keep up with the US in economics, in addition to the internal political tensions. And the Soviet Union breaks apart in 91.